Arizona sells saguaros, sunsets, and the Grand Canyon, but drive far enough off the main roads and you find another Arizona entirely. Towns that boomed, broke, and were swallowed by the desert without apology. These are 13 ghost towns you were never supposed to find. 13. Vulture City. Vulture City grew around the Vulture gold mine, once the richest gold mine in Arizona history. At its peak, the mine produced enough wealth to build a full company town housing, a school, a saloon, and an assay office. Everything a population needs except safety. Theft was the town's chronic disease. Workers caught stealing ore were hanged from a mesquite tree on the property with a frequency that stopped shocking anyone relatively quickly. 18 men are documented to have been hanged from that tree. The tree is still standing. Vulture City is open for tours now. The crumbling adobe structures preserved in the dry desert air that keeps everything here longer than it deserves to last. Visitors photograph the hanging tree without always registering what they are photographing. Vulture City does not hide what happened here, it simply stopped explaining it. 12. Gleason. Gleason was a copper mining town that attracted two very different kinds of people simultaneously. Workers came to the mine. Tuberculosis patients came for the dry desert air, which physicians of the era prescribed as therapeutic for diseased lungs. For a time, both populations coexisted in a town that was equal parts industrial ambition and desperate medical hope. The mine closed first. The patients stayed until they couldn't. The ruins of the old hospital sit on a hill above the town in a state of collapse that the desert is completing methodically and without sentiment. Gleason's remaining structures, the jail, the saloon foundation, and scattered adobe walls sit below that hill in permanent view of where the sick ones went. The town never separated its two populations in life. The ruins don't separate them either. 11. Chloride. Chloride was founded in 1863, making it one of Arizona's oldest continuously inhabited mining towns. The qualifier continuously inhabited is doing considerable work in that sentence. A small number of residents remain, which technically disqualifies Chloride from ghost town status. Walk its streets on a weekday afternoon, and the distinction feels entirely academic. The old buildings stand in various states of preservation along a main street that sees more lizards than people on most days. Outside town, murals painted directly onto the rock faces by artist Roy Purcell in the 1970s remain vivid and strange psychedelic figures in a desert landscape that has no other context for them. The murals are the most alive thing in Chloride. They were painted by someone passing through. That feels appropriate. 10. Ruby. Ruby was a functioning mining community with real infrastructure and real ambition until 1920, when two separate robbery murders at the general store ended the town's sense of safety in a single year. The killings were brutal enough and close enough together that families began leaving almost immediately. Ruby never recovered its population and never recovered its confidence. The two things turned out to be the same thing. The town site is privately owned today and requires a permit to visit. The old adobe structures, the school, the jail, the store where the murders happened are all still standing in the Santa Cruz Highlands, preserved by dry air and distance from everything. Ruby is one of the best preserved ghost towns in Arizona. It is preserved because nobody wanted to come back. The desert kept it intact in their absence. 9. Goldfield. Goldfield is a reconstruction. The original 1890s mining settlement lasted approximately 5 years before the ore played out and the population dissolved into the desert. What exists today is a tourist attraction built on the original site, recreated storefronts, staged gunfights, mine tours, gift shops. The reconstruction has now existed significantly longer than the original town it is based on. That fact produces a specific kind of unease that is difficult to articulate cleanly. Goldfield is performing authenticity on a site where authenticity existed briefly and then vanished entirely. The original miners came here chasing something real and left with nothing. The reconstruction came after chasing something commercial and stayed. Arizona has genuine ghost towns with genuine histories. Goldfield is the ghost of a ghost. That distinction matters more than the staged gunfights suggest. 8. Dos Cabezas. Dos Cabezas sits beneath a mountain formation that resembles two human heads, well enough that the resemblance became the town's entire identity. The name means two heads in Spanish. It was a stage stop, a mining supply point, and briefly a ranching community. 3 different identities tried in sequence. None of them sustained long enough to define the place permanently. The ruins sit in the Sulphur Springs Valley between the Dos Cabezas Mountains and the Dragoon Range in a landscape so visually dramatic that it is genuinely difficult to understand why the town failed. The mountains are extraordinary. The light in the late afternoon is extraordinary. The remains of the old stage station and the scatter of collapsed structures suggest a place that had every geographical advantage and ran out of economic reasons to continue anyway. The 2 heads on the mountain are still there. Everything below them is not. 7. Harshaw. Harshaw was a silver mining camp in the Patagonia Mountains that was doing well enough by the standards of 1880s Arizona mining towns. Population growing, ore coming out, structures going up. Then a catastrophic flash flood in 1890 came through the canyon and destroyed most of what had been built in a single afternoon. The kind of afternoon that resets all previous progress to 0 without negotiation. The town was partially rebuilt, enough to continue for a few more years while the silver held out. When the silver ran out, the rebuilding stopped exactly where it was and never resumed. What remains of Harshaw sits in the Patagonia Mountains in a state that reflects both the flood and the abandonment simultaneously. The desert makes no distinction between natural destruction and economic failure. It treats both the same way. It moves in and finishes the job. 6. Mouri. Mouri sits in the Patagonia Mountains holding a piece of Civil War history that most Arizona histories are content to leave undisturbed. The mine was named for Sylvester Mouri, a former Army officer and mine owner who was arrested in 1862 on charges of supplying lead to Confederate forces. The Union Army confiscated his mine, imprisoned him without trial, and held him for months. When Mouri was released, the mine had been stripped of its equipment and its value by the very government that had seized it. The town dissolved. Mouri died in London 3 years later, broke and unvindicated. Whether he was genuinely a Confederate sympathizer or simply a convenient target remains historically contested. The ruins in the Patagonias don't resolve that question. They just hold it quietly in a part of Arizona where very few people think to look. 5. Courtland. Courtland was established in 1909, reached a population of 2,000 by 1912, and was functionally abandoned by 1942. The entire arc of the place, birth, ambition, collapse, compressed into 3 decades in the Sulphur Springs Valley, where the copper was real, but the future wasn't. Courtland never had time to develop the kind of institutional memory that helps towns survive difficult periods. It went from nothing to nothing too fast for anyone to build anything durable. The jail is the best preserved structure remaining. In a town that existed for 30 years, the most durable thing they constructed was the place to lock people up. That detail is either darkly funny or deeply revealing depending on your tolerance for what boom towns actually were beneath the ambition. The desert has the rest of Courtland now. It accepted the handover without ceremony. 4. Pierce. James Pierce was a rancher who found gold on his own property in 1894 entirely by accident. He was looking for a lost cow. What he found instead was one of the most productive gold deposits in Arizona history. The Commonwealth mine that followed produced millions. The town that followed produced everything a boomtown reliably produces: saloons, ambition, violence, and a complete structural inability to survive the mine's inevitable closure. The mine closed. The town followed on a slight delay. What remains of Pierce is a quiet scatter of ruins and a handful of occupied homes sitting in permanent adjacency to what used to be there. The old store is still standing, its walls thick adobe, its windows long empty. James Pierce went looking for a cow and accidentally built a town. The town outlasted the cow by decades and the mine by not much. 3. Bumblebee. Bumblebee is one of Arizona's oldest settlements, sitting in the Bradshaw Mountains, where the terrain is rough enough to explain why anyone stopped here, but not quite rough enough to explain why anyone stayed. It served as a stage stop and supply point through the territorial period, never large enough to qualify as a boom town, never empty enough to qualify as fully abandoned. Bumblebee existed in the uncomfortable middle ground between those two states for most of its history. The entire town was listed for sale in the 1980s and eventually sold to a buyer whose development plans never materialized. Bumblebee sits today in a state of interrupted intention, structures standing in various stages of collapse, the desert advancing on its own schedule with complete indifference to whatever the buyer planned. Some places get swallowed by ambition. Bumblebee got swallowed by the absence of it. The desert is finishing what the sale started. 2. Oatman. Oatman produced over $3 million in gold during the early 20th century and sat on Route 66 at the height of that highway's cultural dominance. Then, the federal government issued War Production Board Order L. 208 in 1942, declaring gold mining non-essential to the war effort. The mines closed within weeks. The population that had built its entire existence around those mines dissolved almost overnight into the Mojave with nowhere specific to go. The burros that had worked the mines were released into the surrounding desert. They stayed. They are still there, wandering Oatman's main street freely, stopping traffic, accepting carrots from tourists who drive out specifically to photograph them. The burros outlasted the economy that brought them to this particular stretch of desert. They outlasted the miners, the saloons, the Route 66 boom, and every subsequent plan anyone had for Oatman. There is something that worth sitting with longer than most people do. 1. Jerome. Jerome was called the wickedest town in the West at its peak and made a reasonable case for the title. 15,000 residents, more than 20 saloons, a red light district operating openly on a hillside above a copper deposit so rich it produced over $1 billion in ore over its lifetime. Jerome was built on Cleopatra Hill at angles so steep that the town jail literally slid 225 feet downhill from mine blasting vibrations. It sits where it landed. It is now a tourist attraction. The population collapsed to 50 people by the 1950s. Artists discovered it in the 1960s, the way artists discover places that ambition vacated, drawn by cheap space and the particular atmosphere that genuine history leaves behind when commerce stops sanitizing it. Jerome survived by becoming strange. The Victorian buildings cling to the hillside above the Verde Valley in a configuration that still looks structurally improbable a century later. Jerome is the most alive ghost town in America. Whether that makes it a success story or a contradiction depends entirely on what you think ghost towns are supposed to do. These towns are not failures. They are honest. They boomed when the resource was there and stopped when it wasn't. No pretense. No prolonged decline dressed up as something else. The desert does not mourn what it reclaims. It simply waits. Arizona has been waiting out human ambition for centuries. These 13 towns are proof that the desert is more patient than any of us.